Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to dive into today's topic, mostly because it's something that touches literally all of our lives in one way or another. I mean, we live in a world where everyone jokingly claims to be addicted to something, right? Whether it's that overwhelming compulsion to check your smartphone the very second you wake up, or binge watching a new show until 3 a.m. when you know you have an early meeting, or, the sheer existential panic of facing a Monday morning without your cup of coffee. But how do we actually separate a deeply ingrained bad habit from a true clinical addiction? Well, today, we're going to completely demystify clinical addiction. We're stripping away the cultural buzzwords and diving into the hard science. To guide our journey through the research today, we're going to use the rule of threes as our map. We've got 5 main stops. First, the 3 core features. Second, 3 interacting neural systems. Third, the diagnostic shift. Fourth, assessing behavioral addictions. And finally, the 3 rules for new addictions. Basically, we're starting with outward behavioral symptoms, moving inward to the brain's mechanics, and finishing up with the strict rules scientists use to evaluate modern behaviors. Let's get to it.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the 3 core features. Before we can even begin to understand the brain, we really have to look at the foundational behavioral symptoms that tell a clinician an addiction is actually present.
So, this is a question you've probably asked yourself at some point. When does a habit actually cross the line into a clinical addiction? Because we all have routines, right? We have behaviors we repeat, sometimes to our own detriment. Take me, for example. I literally cannot walk past a bakery without going in and buying a croissant. I just can't do it. But everyday quirks like that are very, very different from the strict clinical definitions used by medical professionals. So let's look at the specific criteria that define that boundary.
According to researchers like Koob and Volkow in the SAGE Handbook, true addictive behaviors feature 3 central pillars. Number 1, there's a compulsive seeking to engage in the use of the substance or behavior. Number 2, a profound loss of control regarding the amount or frequency of use. You can't just stop at 1. It's like the internal stop switch is completely broken. And number 3, there is an emergent negative motivational state. This means you don't just miss the thing, you feel physically or psychologically awful. You feel anxious or deeply distressed when you aren't engaging in it. Together, these 3 things form the absolute bedrock of a substance use disorder.
Now, what's really interesting here is the concept of craving. For a long time, this wasn't actually explicitly categorized in the same way. But modern diagnostics specifically added craving, which is an urge so powerful you literally cannot focus on anything else because it perfectly bridges the gap between those outward behavioral features we just talked about and the physical reality of the brain. And speaking of the brain,
Let's dive right into Section 2, 3 interacting neural systems. We're transitioning inward now to look at the biological framework of addiction.
Based on some fascinating research out of Cambridge, addiction occurs when there's a fundamental imbalance between 3 specific neural systems. It helps to think of this exactly like a car. First, you have a hyperactive striatum. This region relies heavily on dopamine and acts as the accelerator. It aggressively pushes impulsive, automatic habits. Second, you have a hypoactive prefrontal cortex. This is supposed to be your brake. It helps you resist short-term rewards for long-term goals. But in addiction, that brake is completely broken. Finally, scientists identified a third modulating system, essentially the driver, that struggles to control the pedals when they are malfunctioning so spectacularly. Just imagine what that actually feels like for the person in the driver's seat for a second. Your foot is mashed on the gas, the brakes are cut, and you're desperately trying to steer, but you have zero control over the vehicle. It's terrifying, and it perfectly illustrates why willpower alone just isn't enough to stop.
Interestingly enough, psychological theories also use a rule of 3 to explain this, just from a slightly different angle. Psychodynamic models point to things like underdeveloped ego functions, which, by the way, is really just a fancy clinical way of saying a person struggles to self-regulate or cope with everyday stress. There's a failure to internalize soothing qualities, and that leads to this fascinating concept called jouissance. It describes a deviant, almost painful pursuit of pleasure. In this state, the pursuit of enjoyment becomes completely all-consuming and deeply detached from a healthy reality. It's not even about having fun anymore. It is a desperate drive that completely bypasses logic.
Okay, so how do doctors actually diagnose all of this? That brings us to Section 3, the diagnostic shift. We're going to look at how the medical community historically categorized these complex issues and how that's evolved recently.
For years, the psychiatric community relied on the DSM-4, which split problems into a 2-tiered system: substance abuse and substance dependence. The whole assumption back then was that abuse was just a milder stepping stone on the way to dependence. But Well, the data proved this false. Many people experience severe abuse issues without any physical dependence, and vice versa. So the modern DSM-5 shifted to a unified system, the Substance Use Disorder Continuum. Now it treats it all as one continuous spectrum of severity rather than two isolated buckets.
When researchers actually mapped the old DSM-4 criteria directly over to the modern DSM-5, the criteria were completely merged into a single comprehensive disorder checklist. And this is where we see craving added as a brand new vital metric. But also notice that legal problems was removed from the criteria entirely. Why? Because research showed legal consequences were way too heavily influenced by cultural inconsistencies and systemic biases. They just weren't a reliable, objective medical indicator of a disease.
Out of all those criteria on the continuum, 2 is the magic number. Under the DSM-5, a patient has to meet at least 2 criteria within a 12-month period to trigger even a mild diagnosis. And why 2? Because it actively prevents overdiagnosis. For instance, if someone is taking a legally prescribed medication, they might naturally build a physical tolerance and experience withdrawal if they suddenly stop. That's just biology. But without a second behavioral criterion, like a total loss of control, those physical bodily reactions alone do not equal a clinical addiction.
And that sets us up perfectly for Section 4, Assessing Behavioral Addictions. We're pivoting away from chemical substances now and moving toward the modern frontier of psychology.
So, this brings us right back to you and me. What about our everyday habits? Can late-night scrolling, compulsive video gaming, or retail therapy truly be measured by the exact same clinical criteria as a chemical substance abuse disorder? Can a behavior literally act as a drug?
The short answer is yes, but the bar is incredibly high. The International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-11, recently established these 3 specific diagnostic guidelines for gaming disorder, and you'll probably notice the direct echoes of the substance criteria we explored earlier. First, impaired control over the behavior. Second, the behavior takes increasing priority over everything else in life. And third, continuation despite severe negative consequences. This triad now sets the absolute gold standard template for evaluating all other potential behavioral addictions.
But as you might guess, scientists are extremely cautious about labeling every modern vice a disease. Let's explore why in our final section, 3 rules for new addictions.
To prevent the medicalization of normal life, researchers like Matthias Brand and his colleagues in their 2020 paper proposed 3 strict meta-level rules. For a new behavior to qualify as a specified addictive disorder, it has to clear these 3 hurdles. First, clinical relevance, meaning it must cause severe functional impairment in daily life. Second, theoretical embedding, meaning the behavior doesn't just superficially look like an addiction, it actually has to fit perfectly into our existing neuroscientific frameworks. And third, empirical evidence. There must be hard biological and psychological data proving it operates like known addictions in the human brain.
To see this scientific rigor in action, researchers use strict yes or no gateways before ever classifying a new behavioral phenomenon. If a behavior doesn't cause severe functional impairment, boom, the flow stops, no classification. If it doesn't fit existing addiction theories, it's categorized elsewhere. It forces the entire scientific community to prove every single sequential step before they ever diagnose the public.
When we stack up 3 hotly debated modern behaviors against these meta-criteria, the results are pretty revealing. Problematic pornography use and buying shopping disorders currently have strong, compelling evidence across all 3 areas. They show clear clinical impairment, and their underlying brain mechanisms directly mirror substance addiction. However, social network use is still heavily debated. While it absolutely causes distress for some people, the neurobiological findings are still incredibly mixed. Basically, the scientific jury is still out on whether it's a true addiction or just a highly engaging, heavily incentivized habit.
This entire debate is perfectly summarized by a really powerful quote from that 2020 Brand paper. They state, "It is important not to over-pathologize everyday life behavior while concurrently not trivializing conditions that are of clinical importance and that deserve public health considerations." And honestly, that is the ultimate dilemma. It's a profound responsibility for the scientific community to validate real suffering without turning every single bad habit into a medical disease.
So the crucial takeaway here is this delicate balance. Understanding these rigorous clinical criteria, the rules of 3 we've explored today, prevents us from trivializing the experiences of those who are suffering from genuine, debilitating functional impairment. If we just call everything an addiction, the word entirely loses its meaning. And the people who truly need medical intervention, they might not be taken seriously.
Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. I want you to look at your own routines. Is your daily scrolling just a harmless, maybe slightly annoying habit? Or does it check all three boxes of impaired control, priority over your life, and continuation despite negative consequences? Understanding the science of addiction gives us the power to honestly and accurately evaluate our own behaviors. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating topic with me today, and I hope this provided a much clearer lens through which to view the habits that shape our daily lives. Catch you next time.